greatest problems that's been created by progressivism, both the original movement and its persistence over time, has been a development of the mindset of many Americans that government is a problem solver, that for every human problem there is a governmental solution. It really points to the importance and to the power of education in this country, because progressivism came in through the American university. The American university was the way in which ideas very foreign to those on which our country was founded were imported from Europe into the United States, and it shows you how university education affects the ideas at the top and trickles down throughout all levels and very much affects the public culture, the public's political mind. And it's why it seems to me the hope for restoration is also in education.
Hello, my name is Maggie. I'm a junior majoring in American Studies at Hillsdale College. This is part of a 10-week course, Constitution 101, presented by Hillsdale College. Today, you'll be hearing from R.J. Pastrito, the Charles and Lucius Shipley Chair in the American Constitution and Associate Professor of Politics. He is also the Dean of Hillsdale's Graduate School of Statesmanship. He'll be speaking today on the progressive rejection of the founding. Please watch.
You guys have been studying in your classes so far the Constitution, obviously, the principles of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and studying a little bit about the fate of those principles in the 19th century. And we're going to talk today about the move from the 19th century into the 20th century in the progressive era. And as students of American politics and American history, I think it's the case that if you really want to understand politics today, what's going on in our political life today, and how we got to this point, and as you may have noticed, politics today is a little bit different than the way it was in the eras that you've been studying thus far in the course. If you want to talk about how it came to be this way, I think there really may be no more important an era to study and no more important kind of thought to study than the progressive era and progressivism. So that's what we're here for today. And of course, regardless of whether we think it's a good development or a bad development, regardless of where you come from politically, certainly there's no question that the scope of government today, the purpose of government today, the way we understand the role of government today is very, very different, of course, than that which was envisioned by the framers of the Constitution. The administrative state that we have, the welfare state that we have, very much built upon a direct rejection, very much built upon a conscious rejection. You'll see this in the progressives. They know what came before them, and they're very explicit about having to change things. So what we have today is very much built on a rejection of our original principles and the ideas behind the Constitution. Now, in practical terms, as you know for sure, this sort of revolution in American politics really came to flourishing in Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. It was subsequently extended by Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and really maintained by the presidential administrations from presidents of both major political parties. But it's also the case that the intellectual roots of the New Deal and the progeny of the New Deal took hold in the progressive era. And in fact, if you want proof of that, don't take my word for it. Go see the words of Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt is laying out the principles of the New Deal. He openly grounds those principles in progressivism. When he's campaigning for president in 1932, he's pointing back and naming Theodore Roosevelt and especially Woodrow Wilson as the sort of intellectual foundations for his program to change American government. So if progressivism is so important, let's start by talking about what it is. What is this thing called progressivism? And of course, most of our session is going to be about filling in the details in answer to that question. But to take a sort of short definition here, progressivism, I think you can think of it as an argument to progress or to move beyond, to get over the political principles of the American founding. If you want to summarize what's at the core, what's at the heart of a lot of the progressive speeches and writings that you'll see, it's that argument that things are different, times have changed, we need to have a flexibility, we need to think more historically, we need to think in terms of catching up with new circumstances, we need to get beyond the notion of government that we have had in this country thus far. More specifically, in terms of the kinds of policies, it's an argument to enlarge vastly the scope of national government. The reason that progressives are arguing for that, for this radical change, is that the historical circumstances, they say, they point to. So look at what's happening in our country right now. Think of your American history. You can think of everything that's going on in the second half of the 19th century as you're coming to the turn of the 20th century. All of the industrialization, the immigration, all of the economic problems, and the progressives are arguing these things were simply not envisioned and could not be envisioned by those who framed the Constitution. It's not a criticism of them. It's just the simple fact that we're dealing with things in terms of circumstances we find ourselves in today that far exceed our founders' vision of government. So what was the founders' vision? Right? Well, it was a limited one. We know that from what you've learned in the course so far, right? We know that the founders say there are certain there's a certain set of principles which define just government, and these principles come from human nature. And this human nature, this law of nature, as it's referred to in the Declaration of Independence, it's permanent. It's permanent. Human beings don't change essentially. And so this is a permanent account of human nature that the founders have. Progressives counter that. We'll see that. They want to suggest that the ends of government, the scope of government, have to be redefined in each new historical era. That you can't simply talk about a single notion of just government, which is right at all times and for all people. Now, the progressives coupled this perspective, which I call kind of, I use the term historical contingency to think about government, because it means when you talk about what just government is, you say, well, the answer to that depends. It's contingent on the particular time and place that we're in. What set of circumstances do we have to deal with? We're going to take our notion of just government and adapt it to make it contingent upon what's going on here and now. So they take this notion, this perspective of historical contingency, and they couple it with a deep faith in historical progress. Right? And by that I mean they believed that there had been historical evolution, that because of it, because of the evolutionary power of history, government was becoming less of a danger to the governed and more capable of solving the new array of problems that was besetting the human race at the time. Right? You remember from your previous sessions that when we're talking about the Federalists, you're talking about James Madison, they certainly believed that the people were capable of popular government. Otherwise, why are we even bothering trying to frame a constitution? But you've got to be careful because, remember in Federalist 10, the latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. What does that mean? It means man is capable of reason, but he's also driven by his passions. Reason and passion are always warring with each other in the human soul. Right? And so government has to be constructed very carefully in order to soberly take into account the fact that man's passions sometimes get the better of his reason. And that's a permanent problem. There are some out there among the anti-federalists against whom the Federalists are arguing that say, well, we've been through this period of enlightenment, and while man may not have been very cognizant of his own best interest, centuries in the past, and well, we know there's been this history of warfare, among men. But now we've gone through this period of enlightenment, and we know that, more or less left to their own devices, men will be just fine. Just let them govern themselves, leave these states kind of unconnected, without any referee between them, and there shouldn't be any reason for worry. And Madison reminds us in the Federalist that is a utopian view, and he points to history as proof, both ancient and modern history, to show us that human nature is relatively the same. Okay? So the progressives want to counter that with this doctrine of historical contingency and faith in progress. History has helped us overcome the factiousness of human nature that the Federalists thought was permanent. Now, as a matter of history, talking about progressivism, these ideas essentially formed a sort of common thread among the most important American thinkers, basically from the 1880s through the 1920s and beyond. In fact, some would argue that progressivism is as alive today as it ever was. But in terms of this historical period we call the Progressive Era, we're really talking about the writings and speeches of folks like Theodore Roosevelt, of course, and a well-known American president, Woodrow Wilson, also an American president, although a very prolific scholar for decades before he came into the presidency. Herbert Croly, very prominent progressive intellectual, very influential in the founding of the journal The New Republic. John Dewey, of course, probably America's greatest kind of public philosopher in the first half of the 20th century. Robert La Follette, very influential in the various state reform movements that were very big in the progressive era. Many, many others. I'm just naming here probably the most prominent national progressives. There's a lot going on, of course, at the state and local level, which is very influential that we really can't get into in a kind of survey lecture. It's just the most prominent national progressives. So let's start with the question, if it's the case that progressivism is about getting beyond the Constitution, getting beyond the founding to something new, to something different, let's first ask, what is it about the Constitution, what is it about the Declaration that the progressives found particularly objectionable? Right? What was inadequate, what was problematic about those documents and their ideas, their structure, that was impeding the agenda that progressives had during their own day? So if you think about it, the progressive era is the first period in American history where the primary characteristic of it is the open and direct criticism of the Constitution. Okay. Now, no doubt there are critics of the Constitution throughout American history, including at the time the Constitution was being framed. We know that. But what makes the progressive era so different is that for the progressive era, this was the dominant theme of the most important writers and thinkers of that time. And that's really the first time in American history that we have that. Readers are reminded in almost any progressive text they pick up, audiences are reminded in almost any progressive speech that they would listen to that the Constitution was old, that it was written to deal with circumstances that had long ago passed us by, and had been replaced by a whole new set of pressing economic and social ills. Now, the progressives were very intelligent men. They were very well-read men. They were very honest men. So this is one of the refreshing things. As a scholar of the progressives, when you go and you look back at their speeches and writings, they're not trying to hide their criticism of the Constitution because, gosh, they're worried, well, gee, this will sound unpatriotic or people won't like. They're very, very direct. We have a new conception of government we need to employ. The old conception of government is a problem, and here's why. And so if you look at those progressive texts that you have in your Constitution reader, you don't have to take my word for it. Take their word for it. And go through and see what the criticism is of our Constitution and of our founders. And they're very open and honest about that, and it's very fruitful to study them for that reason. Okay? Let's take the Constitution first. What do they think about the Constitution? Well, they knew the intention of the Constitution. They knew the structure of the Constitution very well. They knew that it established a framework for limited government. They knew that these limits were to be upheld by a variety of institutional mechanics. Right? So you've had sessions on the separation of powers and what Publius in the Federalist Papers calls the auxiliary precautions, these great improvements to the science of politics, checks and balances, separation of powers, representation, independent judiciary, all these things which are meant to very carefully check and have one part guard the other parts and make sure no part exceeds its constitutional boundaries. Right? The progressives understand all that very, very well. They know that these limits are a major obstacle to implementing their policy agenda. Again, if you take, for example, a look at the Progressive Party platform from 1912, this is probably the clearest example, you get a clear idea of what their agenda is. It's a series of legislative programs, mostly, which were aimed at regulating significant portions of the American economy, significant portions of American society, at redistributing private property, all in the name of social justice. And so the Constitution, if it was to be interpreted and applied faithfully, progressives understood it stood as an obstacle. So that's kind of the general problem with the Constitution. What about the Declaration? Because the progressives also understood that the Constitution was only a means to an end. It's a form of government designed to achieve certain ends of government. Well, Declaration of Independence lays out those ends. And I know you've talked about that in the class so far. The Declaration lays out this idea that the purpose of a constitution, of any government, is to achieve and to secure man's natural rights. Progressives see that in the Declaration. Right? It's why many of the more theoretical works written by progressives feature very sharp attacks on natural rights theory, on the philosophy of social compact, which was of course, very influential, as I'm sure you know by now, on the framing of the Declaration, sharp attacks on the idea that the fundamental purpose of government is to secure the individual natural rights of citizens. Now, while most ordinary Americans, most founders certainly, did not subscribe to the radical epistemology of social compact theory, they did believe, after the fashion of John Locke and others, John Locke, the great English political theorist, that men as individuals possess rights by nature. Right? And I know you've been through all this, right? They're rights that any just government is bound to uphold. These are rights, of course, that stood as inherent and very strong limits to the authority of government over individual life, liberty, and property. Okay. The regulatory aims, the redistributive aims of the progressive policy agenda essentially were on a collision course with the political philosophy of the American founding, with the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. Progressives understood this. As I say, they're smart men, they're well-read men. This basic fact makes understandable an admonition that Woodrow Wilson made not just once, but the instance of it I have in mind here is in an address that Wilson gave, which was ostensibly honoring Thomas Jefferson. Right? Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence. And Wilson said, quote, "If you want to understand the real Declaration of Independence, do not repeat the preface." Right? Do not repeat the preface. Well, what's in the preface? Well, don't repeat that part of the Declaration which enshrines natural rights as the end, the purpose of American government. All that part about the nature of man, by the law of nature, the basic equality of our rights, and any just government is bound to uphold these rights. This is a permanent end of government. Just leave that part out, Wilson said. Leave that part out. Well, if we left that part out, what would we be left with? What's in the rest of the document? Take a look at it. All right. Well, it's the litany of grievances against George III. It's an explanation of all those specific things that George III had done or not done, which were in violation of the general principles which are laid out in what Wilson calls the preface. It's like when you read a book, any book you go to the bookstore, no one ever reads the preface. That's just kind of irrelevant, kind of front matter while you're thanking your mother and your wife and so on, and you get to the real meat of it. For Wilson, yeah, that's what the natural rights stuff is at the front of the Declaration. Okay. Well, if you just focus on the litany of grievances against George III, then what does the Declaration become? It becomes essentially an article of history. Here are some things that were going on in the past. It's merely a practical document. It's simply a set of kind of time-bound responses to a set of specific historical circumstances. By the way, is George III alive anymore in the Progressive era, or is he off there doing any of these things? Well, no. So anything the Declaration might have to say is no longer relevant, right, under Wilson's way of thinking about it. So focus on government, again, that idea of historical contingency. Government is tied to the specific things going on right now. Those conditions change, government changes. Right? That's what's going on in Wilson's criticism of the Declaration. Now, like Wilson, the progressive academic Frank Goodnow, who's much less well known, but very important, very prominent, very influential. He, in fact, was the very first president of the American Political Science Association. The progressive era witnessed the spawning of all of the modern professional academic associations. So Goodnow was the very first president of the APSA. Frank Goodnow acknowledged, this is in a talk he gave in 1916, that the founder system of government, he said, yeah, it's all about securing individual rights. It's all about that stuff there in what Wilson calls the preface to the Declaration of Independence. Goodnow admits, yes, this goal came out of this basic idea of social compact that the founders had. They subscribed to Locke's view of it. Again, not buying all of Locke's kind of radical epistemology, but the basic tenets of social compact. And there's an essay from Goodnow in your reader. There's a copy of the speech in your Constitution reader. It's that speech that's titled The American Conception of Liberty. It's a short little essay. And Goodnow goes through this argument in a very nice, concise way. And he says, here's what the founders thought. They subscribed to social compact. They believed social compact laid out the permanent ends of government, focused on the individual. And then Goodnow goes on to contrast that view to the philosophy that he himself prefers, he says, which was then popular in Europe right around the turn of the 20th century. And in contrast to the American system, Goodnow goes on to praise the European system. Right? So if we take a look at that little bit from Goodnow in your reader on the American conception of liberty, this is what Goodnow says. He's contrasting the 18th century philosophy of the founders to what's going on in his time in Europe, and he's saying, we've got to get with the program here with the Europeans. So he says that the end of the 18th century was marked by the formulation and general acceptance by thinking men in Europe of a political philosophy which laid great emphasis on individual private rights. Man was by this philosophy conceived of as endowed at the time of his birth with certain inalienable rights. And he talks about the idea of social contract, and he says social contract treated man as primarily an individual and only secondarily as a member of human society. Right? So that's late 18th century, that's the founders, that's back in the past. Right? And then Goodnow says, here's what's going on in Europe, and here's how we need to get with the program today. He says, man is regarded now throughout Europe, contrary to the view expressed by these social contract thinkers, as primarily a member of society and secondarily as an individual. The rights which he possesses, the rights which an individual possesses, are, it is believed, conferred upon him not by his creator, but rather by the society to which he belongs. What they are, so what man's rights are, what they are is to be determined by the legislative authority in view of the needs of that society. Social expediency, rather than natural right, is thus to determine the sphere of individual freedom of action. And so think about it. You can't get any clearer than that. Right? What determines man's freedom? His God-given natural rights, which are permanent, which government can't trespass, just because it thinks it's convenient. Goodness says no. Social expedience, whatever is needed right now, whatever the current historical circumstances call for, that's what determines your rights. That's what determines your liberty. This is what I mean by the idea of historical contingency. Your rights, and thus government's duty to respect them, is contingent upon what's expedient for society right now. And so Goodnow, Wilson, other progressives, they take this idea of historical contingency and they run it up against the Declaration's notion that the principles of just government are essentially permanent. Now, often this is not put in terms of a criticism of the founders, because the argument is often that the natural rights understanding of government made perfect sense during the founding era. It was perfectly natural that the founders came up with this idea. It was appropriate as a response to the prevailing tyranny of that day. If, in fact, you have all of those things that George III did or didn't do, well then, this is perfectly understandable that you'd have this very limited notion of government and this maximum emphasis on individual liberty, and makes perfect sense. That was then, this is now. Right? Government has to be understood as a product of its particular historical context. So the great sin committed by the founding generation wasn't in putting forth this theory of natural rights and adhering to it and structuring a government on the basis of it. Nothing wrong with that. Rather, the problem is this idea that this doctrine of natural rights was actually meant for everybody at all times. That it wasn't just, hey, this is what we need to do now because it's right for us, but this notion that it transcended time and place. This language that Jefferson used about the nature of man. Right. Now that very facet of the founders' thinking, the idea that they're talking about what defines just government, not just for them, but for all men everywhere at all time. That's the very facet of it that Abraham Lincoln praised and that he referred to repeatedly in his speeches. In fact, there's a great speech that Lincoln gives. It's actually not a speech, it's in a letter that he writes in 1859. And he was writing to someone about Thomas Jefferson and about the Declaration. And Lincoln wrote the following. He said, "All honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, the forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth, applicable to all men and all times." Right? So that's Lincoln in 1859. And he's saying that's the genius of Jefferson. It wasn't just about, here's what we need to say to overthrow the British rule in North America right now. Jefferson used that instance to speak to principles of government that applied to everybody. Now, if you fast forward to the progressives, and John Dewey in particular, it's that very part of the founders' philosophy that he finds most objectionable. The very thing that Lincoln points to as essential, as most important in that passage about Jefferson, Dewey says, see that's the problem. That assumption that their own particular notions of government somehow would apply to other times in history and ought to apply to other times in history. That's the problem. So if you look in that essay that's in your Constitution reader, written by John Dewey, the Liberalism and Social Action, it's an excerpt from it. It's a longer essay, but it's just an excerpt that you have there. He said that way of thinking, the way that Jefferson thought, the way that Lincoln praised in that passage that I just quoted, that way of thinking is a relic. It's a relic of the older liberalism in America. History had changed things. We new liberals understand this. Right? And so Dewey's essay, you'll see there in the reader, is about contrasting the old liberalism and the new liberalism. Right? Let's take a look at that real briefly here. Here's what Dewey writes in Liberalism and Social Action, criticizing the earlier liberals. By the earlier liberals, he means the founders, the Jefferson, the Lincoln's notion of what's important about the Declaration, its timelessness, and so on. Dewey writes the following. He says, "Those earlier liberals lacked historic sense and interest. But disregard of history took its revenge. it blinded the eyes of liberals to the fact that their own special interpretations of liberty, individuality, and intelligence were themselves historically conditioned and were relevant only to their own time. They put forward their ideas as immutable truths, good at all times and places, but they had no idea of historic relativity. Right? So that's the problem. Lincoln says, the great thing about Jefferson, he knew these principles were applicable to all men in all times. Dewey here says, that's the problem with Jefferson. Right? He didn't understand those principles were relevant only to his own time. So it's a very nice contrast there in that piece in your reader. What Dewey goes on to explain in that essay is that the idea of liberty is not frozen in time. We liberals are all for the idea of liberty. That's what we have, and we share that with the older liberals. But what does liberty mean? Well, liberty's meaning isn't permanent. Liberty has a history of evolving meaning, Dewey explains. And so the history of liberalism, and that's what he's writing about, liberalism and social action, it's a progressive history. It's a story. It's a narrative of the move from a more primitive to a more mature form of liberty. And therefore, it represents just a vast improvement over classical liberalism, or what Dewey called early liberalism. So it's a radically new way of thinking about government. Where did it come from? Where did it come from? This coupling of historical contingency with the doctrine of progress, which was shared by all progressives to one degree or another. Right? And for the sake of a survey session here, we're making some generalizations, of course, but I think to one degree or another, it's a very fair statement. It certainly reveals how the progressive movement became the means by which German historicism was imported from Europe into America in the 19th century and into the American political tradition. And the influence of German political philosophy is evident certainly not only by looking at the ideas that were espoused by some of the most important progressives, but also if you look at the historical pedigree of some of the most important progressive thinkers. Almost all of them were either educated in Germany or had as teachers those who had been educated in Germany. And that fact reflects essentially what had been a sea change that took place in American higher education in the second half of the 19th century, a time when most Americans who wanted a higher degree, an advanced degree, went to Europe to get one, and very often to Germany to get one. And so by 1900, the faculties of America's colleges and universities, right, if you wanted to do the trendy thing, if you were a board of trustees or a university or college president, even in a relatively conservative kind of orthodox place, you wanted to get yourself some of these European and German PhDs because that's what you did for prestige at this time. And so by 1900, the faculties of these places are populated with those who had been educated in the German model. Johns Hopkins University, for example. This was a university founded here, of course, in 1876, founded for the express purpose of bringing the German educational model to the United States. No coincidence that it produced several prominent progressives. Woodrow Wilson, John Dewey, Frederick Jackson Turner, all went through Johns Hopkins. Now, among other things, the American progressives took from the Germans, and especially from the great German political philosopher Georg Hegel and his disciples, this critique of individual rights, this critique of social compact theory, this idea that man is an individual, that you got these rights from some permanent notion of nature. And they took from Hegel and the Germans their organic or living notion of the Constitution. And that may be a term about the Constitution that you're familiar with. The idea, you hear it a lot today, right, that, well, if we're going to adapt the Constitution to our own time and values, we need to have a sort of living, flexible view of it. It comes from the progressives, and the progressives got it from the Germans. Woodrow Wilson, when he reflects on what it means to be a progressive, wrote of government as a living thing. He always used that phrase. Government's a living thing. It's got to be understood according to the theory of organic life, he wrote. And this idea of a living constitution was vastly superior to the founders' kind of mechanistic, limited notion, fixed notion of government. The idea that government would be constantly limited through checks and balances and so on. Hopefully you noticed in the speech that is in your Constitution reader there by Woodrow Wilson, the speech, "What is Progress?" It's a speech he gave on the campaign trail in 1912 when he's running for president. It comes from his book, The New Freedom, which is a collection of those speeches. Okay? That speech, "What is Progress?" What do you see there? Wilson is using the language of science to describe the progressive desire for a living constitution. Let's take a look at one of the examples. Here Wilson is talking about the old understanding, the new understanding. He says in What is Progress, "The Constitution of the United States had been made under the dominion of the Newtonian theory. You have only to read the papers of the Federalist to see that fact written on every page. They speak of checks and balances of the Constitution and use to express their idea the simile of the organization of the universe, and particularly the solar system, how by the attraction and gravitation of various parts are held in their orbits, and then they proceed to represent Congress, the judiciary, and the president as sort of an imitation of the solar system." Right? Talk about how Madison talks about the careful balance of the powers of the branches. But here's Wilson's counter to that. He goes on to say, "The makers of the federal Constitution read Montesquieu," this French political philosopher who was very influential, as well as John Locke, read Montesquieu with true scientific enthusiasm. They were scientists in their way, the best way of their age, those fathers of the nation. Jefferson wrote of the laws of nature and of nature's God, and they constructed a government as they would have constructed an orrery to display the laws of nature. Politics in their thought was a variety of mechanics. But the trouble with the theory is that government is not a machine, but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. It is modified by its environment, necessitated by its tasks, shaped to its functions by the sheer pressure of life. No living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live, right, wrote Wilson. And so you just see through this language, Wilson is trying to show you that this living entity, government, has to evolve. It has to adapt in response to all of the changing circumstances that are out there. Right? History had brought about an improvement in the human condition. Liberty is no longer threatened in the way that it had been threatened during the founding era. Take a look at all the new economic and social ills that are out there, and this seems to call out for a new governmental remedy, for adapting government. And so Progressive took this idea of progress, it translated into a call for a sharp increase in the scope of governmental power. Now, there may be no greater example of this phenomenon than Theodore Roosevelt, he's often he's a great American character and someone who's admired by folks on all sides of the political spectrum, but also a man who saw almost no limits to the power of the national government, especially when he was in charge of the national government. And there's a lot of evidence of this, but one of the greatest examples is a speech on the new nationalism, which he gave in 1910, which then became kind of the foundation for his campaign to regain the presidency in 1912. They ran against Wilson and others. But that's a speech where, and if you go take a look at it, it's a speech where he gives you a more radical brand of progressivism than the one he had even espoused as president. He calls for the state to take an active role in affecting economic justice, redistributing property, superintending the use of private property, and he says new circumstances have necessitated a new view of government. He's just very explicit about that in the new nationalism. This idea of natural rights, of property rights, which might serve as a boundary, well, we have to re-examine that. Right? They should no longer, those rights should no longer serve as a principled boundary that the state was prohibited from crossing. If you want another very clear expression of that, it's in your reader. There's this little essay that Woodrow Wilson wrote in the 1880s called Socialism and Democracy. Okay? And it's about the relationship between socialism and democracy. That's why it's called Socialism and Democracy. If you take a look at that essay, it starts out by defining socialism. Wilson says, I'm going to tell you what socialism is. Right? And so, well, what socialism stands for is unfettered state power. State power trumps any notion of individual rights. There's no line which a state cannot cross. Right, so we take a look at that essay real quickly here. Wilson says the following. Socialism is willing to act through state authority. It proposes that all idea of a limitation of public authority by individual rights be put out of view, and that the state consider itself bound to stop only at what is unwise or futile in its universal superintendence alike of individual and public interests. The thesis of the state socialist is that no line can be drawn between public and private affairs which the state may not cross at will. So Wilson says that's what socialism is, essentially. And after he lays out that definition of socialism, he explains that he finds nothing wrong with it in principle. He says this is simply the logical extension of what democracy means, right? It gives all power to the people in their collective capacity, right, majority will essentially, to carry out their will through the exercise of the power of government. If we're really Democrats, small d Democrats, right, we really believe that the people ought to rule, and that means what the people's will is controls what government does, and there ought to be no boundaries to that. That's genuine democracy, unlimited by any undemocratic idea like individual rights, where private individuals, where a minority could say, well, no, you can't cross that line because those are my property rights, those are my liberty rights. Wilson goes on in the essay to say the following. He says, in fundamental theory, socialism and democracy are almost, if not quite, one and the same. They both rest at bottom upon the absolute right of the community to determine its own destiny and that of its members. The absolute right of the community to determine the destiny of its members. Think about that. Men as communities are supreme over men as individuals. Limits of wisdom and convenience to the public control there may be. Limits of principle there are, upon strict analysis, none. No limits of principle to the power of the state. And Wilson says that's, by the way, not just socialism, that's democracy. That's the principle of democracy. Now, in this view, rights-based theories of self-government, such as the republicanism to which the American founders subscribed, the idea that, yes, the majority rules, but it rules within the boundary of the law of nature, and there are certain things that it's unjust even for a majority to consent to because it violates the fundamental rights of man, which is the very reason why man consents to submit himself to civil government in the first place, basic idea of the Declaration. That kind of theory is really not democratic, according to Wilson and the progressives. It hampers the majority. We ought to have faith in the majority. So, as Wilson and his fellow progressives believed, this rights-based republicanism of the founders is not going to work for our circumstances today, the ones we progressives face. It limits the ability of people to implement their collective will and thus represent something less than a real democracy. And so progress for them. You see this in all of the pieces from your reader in the progressive section. Progress for them is about moving on from these limited principles of the founding. It's about opening up the power of government. It's about a faith in the people to use government in a way that won't be a threat to the liberty of their fellow citizens. Okay? So there's a lot more to the story, but if you want the rest of the story, you've got to come and take a separate course on progressivism here at the college. So we'll leave you with that for now.